In 1860, a woman was locked in an asylum, not because she was insane, because she disagreed with her husband about God. In 1860, Elizabeth Packard had a theological disagreement with her husband. That disagreement cost her everything. He walked her into a psychiatric institution without a trial, without a doctor's evaluation, without a single witness called to speak on her behalf. Illinois law at the time required nothing more than a husband's declaration, one man's word. That was the entire legal standard for erasing a person's life. She stayed inside the Jacksonville Asylum for 3 years. 3 years while 6 children grew up without their mother. When a jury was finally allowed to hear her case, they left the room and came back in 7 minutes. Unanimous. Sane. She had always been sane. Everybody in that courtroom already knew it. So she walked out and she went home. What she found there should stop you cold. The night before her release, her husband had handed the house keys to strangers. The furniture was gone. The bank accounts were empty. Her clothes, her private writings, her savings, all of it taken. Her children had been removed. Then he crossed the state line. Elizabeth Packard stood in front of the home she had built and owned nothing. Not legally, not on paper. When she turned to the courts, she learned the worst part. There was no case to make. Under a legal doctrine called coverture, a married woman did not exist as a legal person. The moment she said, "I do," her identity was absorbed into her husband's. Her wages belonged to him. Her property was his. She could not enter a contract, file a lawsuit, or write a will without his signature. And he could have her institutionalized with no hearing required and no mechanism for her to challenge it. Elizabeth Packard was not an exception. She was the system working exactly as intended. Between October 1864 and December 1889, the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane kept an admissions log. Every patient, every recorded reason for commitment. A historian named Marjorie Carr compiled those records into a pamphlet in 1993. It now sits in the West Virginia Division of Culture and History. The list has 125 entries. Laziness, novel reading, excessive studying, political excitement, religious enthusiasm, romantic disappointment, jealousy, greed, egotism, bad whiskey, snuff use for 2 years, imaginary female complaints, menstrual disruption, domestic trouble. That last one, pause on it. The very first patient ever admitted to that facility was a housewife. The reason recorded beside her name, domestic trouble. Think carefully about what that phrase could mean in 1864. It could mean she argued. It could mean she was visibly unhappy. It could mean she said no to something. The ambiguity was deliberate. The wider the net, the harder it becomes for anyone to prove they were wrongfully caught in it. Now, to be fair, researchers have confirmed this list is authentic, but noted these were recorded as supposed contributing causes, not formal diagnoses. The physicians themselves expressed some discomfort with the categories. So yes, technically, no doctor was writing novel reading as a clinical diagnosis. That clarification is accurate, and it entirely misses the point. Because the system did not require proof. In most states, a husband could bring his wife to an asylum and commit her on his testimony alone. No independent examination, no judge, no legal advocate for the person being institutionalized. Whatever he gave became the official record. So the real question is not whether reading fiction causes mental illness. The real question is, who benefits when a woman who reads can be removed from her home, separated from her children, and stripped of everything she might one day inherit? Once you ask that question clearly, the list stops looking ridiculous. It starts looking like a carefully constructed inventory, comprehensive enough to justify removing anyone who became inconvenient. Now, the mechanism becomes even darker. In 1851, a Louisiana physician named Samuel Cartwright stood before the Medical Association of Louisiana and announced a new disease. He called it drapetomania, combining the Greek for runaway slave with the word for madness. The condition, he argued, caused enslaved people to irrationally desire their own freedom. His logic was straightforward. Slavery was so clearly beneficial that only a diseased mind would seek to escape it. His recommended treatment was whipping. For advanced cases, he proposed amputating both big toes to eliminate the physical possibility of flight. This was not a pamphlet passed around in secret. It was published in Dawes Review, one of the most widely read journals in the American South. It was a committee presentation at a state medical association's annual meeting. Northern newspapers mocked it. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect behind Central Park, wrote a satirical response suggesting the condition must have originated in Europe, since white indentured servants also fled their masters. But here is what actually happened. The term drapetomania remained in Stedman's Practical Medical Dictionary through its third edition, published in 1914. 60 years after it was invented, it was still sitting on the page as a legitimate entry. The joke was visible. No one took it out. After the Civil War ended and 4 million people were legally free, the infrastructure was already in place. In 1840, the federal census had falsely reported that free black Americans in northern states had an insanity rate 10 times higher than enslaved people in the South. Secretary of State John C. Calhoun used that fabricated data to argue that freedom itself was causing psychological deterioration in black Americans. When emancipation came, the asylum system was ready. In 1870, Virginia opened the Central Lunatic Asylum for Colored Insane, the first institution in the United States designated exclusively for black patients. Researchers examining its records found no evidence of a single voluntary admission. The prescribed treatment was farm labor. Patients worked the fields and managed the domestic operations of the facility. If that sounds familiar, it should. The asylum opened 5 years after slavery ended. The treatment was structurally identical to what had come before it. A significant portion of patients died from diseases directly caused by dangerous overcrowding. Segregated psychiatric facilities in Virginia persisted until 1964. Some institutions remained divided by race until 1967. The population changed, the function did not. Then there is Canton. In 1902, the federal government opened the only nationally funded psychiatric institution designated for Native Americans. It sat in Canton, South Dakota. It was not built because any public health emergency had been identified among indigenous communities. It was built because 2 South Dakota congressmen wanted federal money and federal jobs for a state that had been carved directly from indigenous land. Through 3 decades, more than 350 Native Americans from tribes across the country were committed there by force. The documented reasons for admission included refusing to comply with federal assimilation policies, participating in traditional spiritual ceremonies, and being uncooperative with government agents. One man from the Rosebud Reservation received the recorded diagnosis of horse-stealing mania. No interpreters were present during intake. No mental health evaluations were conducted. No therapeutic programs existed inside the facility. Patients were physically restrained to beds. Federal investigators who visited described the building as layered in filth, with patients left lying in their own waste. At least 121 people died there, more than half from entirely treatable illnesses. Canton developed a reputation that reached into the federal boarding schools where Native children were being held across the region.
Elders have testified that children who misbehaved at those schools were told they would be sent to Canton, and everyone understood that Canton meant you did not come back. Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier shut the facility down in 1933. The townspeople of Canton filed a federal lawsuit to block the closure, not out of concern for the patients, but because the asylum was one of the area's largest employers during the Great Depression. The building no longer stands. A municipal golf course occupies the land today. Somewhere near the fifth hole, there is a cemetery where 121 men, women, children, and infants are buried. I keep searching for the version of this history where the system was built with good intentions and collapsed through neglect. I cannot locate it. In 1883, court records from Contra Costa County, California, document a Portuguese immigrant couple, both declared legally insane on the same day. A judge noted in his own handwriting that the husband was too poor to pay. On the same page, he recorded that the wife held 74 acres of land in her name. Their estate was appraised and liquidated. Guardians were appointed for their 3 children. A historian named Richard Fox found that California held the highest per capita rate of insanity commitments in the nation during this period. A superintendent of one of the state's own asylums said publicly that the hospitals would continue serving as a receptacle for all forms of human wreckage, regardless of what law or justice required. He said it plainly. He did not appear troubled by it. Once someone was inside, the system could reach beyond their freedom. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck was 18 years old. She had been classified as feeble-minded following a pregnancy. But Carrie Buck was not feeble-minded. She had been sexually assaulted by the nephew of her foster family. Her foster parents reported her pregnancy as evidence of moral deficiency and arranged her commitment. Then Virginia selected her as the test case for its new sterilization statute. 8 justices agreed with the state. 1 dissented.
Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion. He argued that society held the authority to prevent those it deemed unfit from reproducing, and he closed with 5 words that remain in the legal record. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck was sterilized without her knowledge or consent. She was not told what had been done to her body. Following that ruling, more than 30 states passed sterilization laws. Over 60,000 Americans were sterilized without consent from the 1920s through the mid-1970s. Before the decision, roughly half of those sterilized were male. Afterward, 67% were female. Many were admitted to institutions specifically to be sterilized, then discharged, the institution serving purely as a procedural mechanism. The Virginia statute that authorized what was done to Carrie Buck directly inspired Nazi Germany's 1933 sterilization law. The Nazi regime carried out more than 375,000 forced sterilizations. At the Nuremberg trials, defendants cited Buck v. Bell in their own defense. The Supreme Court has never overturned that ruling. It is still law. In 1887, a 23-year-old reporter named Nellie Bly accepted an assignment from Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. She would simulate mental illness, get herself committed to the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, and report what she found from the inside. She checked into a boarding house under a false name, behaved erratically enough to alarm the other residents, and convinced a sequence of judges and physicians that she required institutionalization. Once inside, she stopped performing. She spoke clearly. She behaved normally. She made no attempt to appear unwell. Nobody noticed. The more lucid she acted, the more the staff interpreted it as evidence of her condition. She found women inside who had been committed by husbands seeking to be rid of them. She found immigrants who spoke no English, trapped in a bureaucracy they could not communicate with.
Patients were beaten, bathed in frigid water that was rarely replaced, forbidden from reading or writing anything. Her report, published October 9, 1887, triggered a grand jury investigation. The city increased the asylum's annual budget by $850,000. The institution closed 7 years later. But the most significant thing Bly documented was not the violence or the neglect, it was the architecture of entry and the near impossibility of exit. She confirmed in 10 days what Elizabeth Packard had spent her entire adult life trying to explain. The system was not designed to identify the mentally ill. It was designed to hold whoever was placed inside it and justify that decision after the fact. Step back far enough and the individual cases dissolve into a single operating logic. The admission log at Western, the coverture laws that annihilated a woman's legal personhood, drapetomania, transforming the instinct for freedom into a clinical disorder, Canton converting indigenous spiritual practice and cultural resistance into grounds for indefinite confinement, Buck v. Bell converting poverty and victimhood into justification for permanent reproductive removal. These are not isolated failures within a generally functional system. They are the same mechanism applied to a rotating cast of inconvenient populations across different decades. The asylum was an instrument for eliminating people who had become problems for someone with more power. The admission list was the paper that made it look official. And the beneficiary was always identifiable. The husband who needed his wife's property gone, the employer who needed a compliant and frightened workforce, the federal government that needed land currently occupied by people who refused to leave, the institution that needed beds filled to maintain its budget allocation and justify its own continued existence. Ask who benefits, and the answer arrives before the question finishes forming. Maybe I'm overreaching. Maybe the admission categories really were just the clumsy shorthand of exhausted physicians trying to document the inexplicable. Maybe coverture was simply an outdated inheritance from English common law that nobody had gotten around to revising. Maybe Canton was simply a mismanaged facility that lacked adequate resources and oversight. But if those explanations are sufficient, then explain the pattern. Explain why every population that lacked the political or legal capacity to resist ended up behind the same kind of walls, under the same kind of authority, losing the same categories of things: their land, their children, their legal name, their reproductive autonomy, their right to be believed when they said something was wrong. A marker near a golf course that no one visits. How many of your own family members vanished into a system like this? How many lines of descent were severed not by accident or illness, but by a person with institutional authority filling out a form? How many inheritances redirected because a husband, a judge, a congressman decided someone had become an inconvenience? The log from Western lists 125 reasons you could be locked away. But the system only ever needed one. Someone with power decided you did not belong, and the paperwork wrote itself.